friends, welcome back to the Crooked Spoon. I'm so glad you're here. In today's video, I'm going to show you how easy it is to make your own English muffins at home. Follow along.
So right away, you're going to notice something different compared to my other videos. English muffins use a straight dough mixing method, which means all ingredients go into one bowl and then onto the mixer. So I won't be setting up my ingredients into their own bowls. The term is called mise en place, which is normally encouraged when you're baking or cooking, because this is a very straightforward recipe, putting all ingredients into one bowl. I'm starting with bread flour, and I'm weighing 500 grams. This recipe yields 12 English muffins, which would be about 3 inches diameter. Now I'm adding in 2.5 grams of instant yeast. I keep that in my refrigerator. I like this recipe because, again, most of us are used to buying English muffins at the supermarket, but once you see how basic and straightforward this recipe is, I hope you're inspired to make them yourself. Next up is kosher salt. This recipe calls for 8 grams. And again, I'll include the recipe in the show notes below. I love to share my recipes. And I do encourage you, if you haven't already, to get a kitchen scale, because my recipes are in weight, metric weight, grams. Next up is granulated sugar. And this calls for 8 grams of sugar. So we have equal parts salt and sugar in this recipe. The nice thing about making English muffins at home is you can control the size. As you'll see below in the show notes, the recommendation is to scale out 60 grams per unit. And that makes for a really nice size, about 3-inch round. But if you want something bigger to make a sandwich, or if you want something smaller to control the portion size, you can do that, which is really great. Okay, the next ingredient is powdered milk. This is something that's really great to have on hand. I like the Horizon brand because it does offer a powdered whole milk. You'll often see powdered milk, but it'll be a low-fat milk. And the concept behind using a non-fat milk solid or a powdered whole milk, whichever you choose, is it's going to give the dough a more concentrated flavor than using liquid milk. It also has a little more protein, so that was going to result in a tender and smooth crumb. And then finally, it really helps the product stay moist longer. So by using the powdered milk, I know that my English muffins will have a nice shelf life. Okay, now I am preparing the butter, 8 grams of softened butter. And previously I had weighed out 375 grams of water. The recipe recommends using cold water because, as you'll see, it is going to spend a lot of time on the mixer. And by using cold water, it helps the dough to not get so overheated. But I haven't really had a problem with using just water from my tap. And there you have it. I mean, that's a very straightforward recipe, putting all of the ingredients into one bowl, very much like a bread machine recipe. I'm fitting my KitchenAid mixer with the dough hook. And since this is considered a straight dough mixing method, I'm going to spend about 4 minutes on the stir, or speed 1 or 2, to just let it get incorporated. But for the stage 2 mixing, it does have to go higher. There's my timer. Gosh, I would be lost if I didn't use my timer. How about you? The second mix actually has to go on for 25 minutes. So that's very long compared to some other bread recipes. So I used my great scraper. I love these Rubbermaid bowl scrapers. And now I've increased the speed on my KitchenAid, set my timer for 25 minutes. And there you go. Through the magic of editing, 25 minutes has already passed. The dough is quite sticky, definitely warmer than it started. And I'm going to scrape the dough off the dough hook. And essentially it has to ferment, it has to proof, it has to rise like any other yeast dough. I'm going to add it to another bowl. And one trick I use for proofing dough, especially when my kitchen is in the 60s and 65, 68 degrees, is I like to put the oven light on and have my dough proof in the oven. And just having my oven light on gives it just enough heat and warmth to encourage it to ferment and proof. So we have a nice amount of dough, adding it to the bowl. I'll include the link for that scraper below, and along with the digital scale that I've been using. I find it so helpful. All right, let's get these covered with saran wrap, keeping the dough nice and fresh. Give me a comment in the below if you have a alternative for saran wrap. I always like to hear what other people use. Sometimes I'll use a dampened tea towel. I am writing the time and what kind of dough it is. Very important not to get it mixed up when I'm making multiple batches of different doughs. And the time helps me remember. Now, dough will ferment and proof and double at all different times. So the best way to test it is really just to push your finger into the dough. And when your finger makes the indentation, if it doesn't fill in and it doesn't spring back, if that indentation stays, then you know your dough has doubled and is ready for the next step. Again, it's very variable, especially if you live in an area where you have seasons. I'm using my bench scraper to help me partition out 60-gram units. Notice how it's very sticky. 60 grams is what was recommended in the recipe, and just because I've done this recipe numerous times, I agree with that number, and I like the size that it makes. I'm tucking the loose ends under, and then I'm essentially going to roll it in my hand. This is a technique commonly used. There's no flour on my counter. I want that friction. And just by jostling it and rolling it between my thumb and my fingers, it makes for a very smooth ball. And I'm placing my rolled ball onto a cookie sheet with parchment paper that has cornmeal powder on it. So when you think of the traditional English muffins that you buy at the store, they're usually are dusted in cornmeal to prevent it from sticking. So we'll be doing the same here. You can just get yellow cornmeal from the store, the kind that you might use if you were baking cornbread. And I'm going to continue rolling 60-gram units and placing them on my cornmeal tray. All right, let me show you one more round here. So I'm aiming for 60 grams and I'm tucking under the sticky loose ends. And then I'm rolling, again, kind of letting the dough do the work. It's sort of sticking to the counter. And moving it in between my thumb and my fingers makes for a very nice round. I'm going to continue working and filling up my tray. And essentially, I'm going to press them down with my fingers until they're about 1/2 inch thick or 3 inches wide. And they don't really need to rest that long after that point. I can get my griddle already warmed up to 325 degrees and start baking off in batches. So here's another tray of 60-gram rounds, and I'll show you in a second how I flatten them. And the griddle works really nice. I mean, that's essentially how they are made in the factories or at bakeries. And I've learned that they need about 6 or 7 minutes on each side, but I'll show you a more accurate way to determine when they're done in just a minute. So here I am flattening out my rounds. As you learn to do batches and experiment as you go, you can always try thicker, thinner, more weight, less weight. It's really fun to be able to experiment and see what works best. Oh, and that's that cornmeal I was telling you about. Just stone ground cornmeal. All right, so it's been about 6 minutes, and now I'm flipping them gently. They're so light, really puffing up nice. They have a great brown on the underside, that signature English muffin look. And they've been now on there for another 6 minutes, but because they're thick, I'm going to test the temperature. And with bread, you're shooting for about 200 degrees. That's when you know your dough is baked and done. But as we know, bread continues to bake. So I'm pulling these off when they're reaching about 190. And what I've learned is sometimes 6 or 7 minutes on each side is just enough. But this batch was definitely a little thicker. So there's a great trick you can do, a little hack, where you finish them off in a 350-degree oven. So while they look lovely on the outside, I know that I didn't get them up to that 190 internal temperature. And so I decided to put them into a 350-degree oven with my probe thermometer inserted into one of them, which is great because then it just, the little alarm goes off when it hits the 190 temperature. If you've ever fork split an English muffin that you bought at a supermarket or at a bakery, well, there they are. They're looking so nice, that signature English muffin look. You'll notice that the inside, when you fork split it, is a little underdone, and that's intentional because most people like to toast their English muffin. So while you don't want your dough inside to be raw, you do want the inside to be a little undercooked, and that's where that 190 setting on my probe thermometer helps me get a very accurate, consistent final product. So I'm going to do the same with the second batch. I'm flipping them over after about 6 minutes. Now after another 6 minutes on the second side, I'm checking the temperature on my probe thermometer. I'll include that link below as well. This is handy for baking, but certainly handy for cooking. And I'll finish these off in a 350-degree oven as well. Notice how they're very tall. This batch came much taller, so they need a little more help getting cooked inside. If I were to have flattened them a little bit more, which I have done in other batches, they might have finished on the griddle. But again, we talk about this, right? Even with the same ingredients, the same baker, the same equipment, you can have variation in your batches. And there we have it. Homemade English muffins. All right, now the trick to getting a great nook and cranny on your English muffin is to fork split it. So I want to show you this little guy. This was a leftover guy, so he probably wasn't 60 grams. Maybe that was only a 40-gram leftover one, so super tiny. But I'm fork splitting it. I want to show you how lovely it looks on the inside. It's soft and light. It smells so good. And see all those little nooks and crannies? And you can tell on that right side one, see how it's a little doughy? It looks a little underdone. And I know that's going to toast up great in my toaster oven. And that left side one has all those signature nooks and crannies, what we've grown to love about English muffins.
Thanks so much for watching, friends. I'll see you in the next video.